So in undergrad, one of the people I talked with on academic topics, like outside of class most frequently, was this guy, Eric Howell, who is now a much more successful Substack blogger than I am, and I think also a professional research scientist. And his thing is trying to integrate science and the humanities, I think. But anyways, we had an argument that I remember vividly, I think on a number of occasions, over the topic of evolutionary psychology. Because I had taken a class where I learned about it, and I found it game-changing, like changed my worldview. Whereas Eric was like, oh, it's just so stories. And I tried to respond, and this is something I've learned not to do now, but it has taken time and experience. I was trying to guess what he meant by just so stories and give counterexamples, and he was not convinced. And what I should have done is tried to understand what did he mean by a just so story and why did he think that. Anyways, so I still believed in it, and I defended it for several years after graduating. And then along came the red pill movement, a big part of which was a lot of ideas that were derived from evolutionary psychology and adapted to a popular audience. And as I've mentioned, I was very much culturally on the left. People I interacted with were. And so they started criticizing me for talking about this stuff as, hey, that's red pill BS. And I was like, no, it's not. Here's the difference between what I'm saying and what these red pill people are saying. And I had to go to their sites to even learn what they were saying. But it became clear they were saying different things from what I believed and understood. And then I just gradually got tired of having these arguments and having to go to the red pill sites, understand what they were saying. And I stopped defending it. And once I stopped defending it explicitly, I ended up operating as if I believed in blank slateism, which I don't think I ever have. But the people around me generally did, and they would claim to operate that way, and I would end up acting that way. And so I realized I need to actually start saying there is value in evolutionary psychology and pushing back and also address the criticisms, because really there are three criticisms that I hear of evolutionary psychology, one of which is close to Eric's original claim, which is that it is not scientific, to which I would say, first of all, modern experimental psychology is not scientific. Arthur Koestler has called it flat earth psychology, and Daniel Dennett called it greedy reductionism, and I'll have videos on that. But modern experimental psychology tries to control for things because of physics envy to the point that you are getting rid of the emergent properties that are actually interesting and then claiming those properties don't exist a lot of the time, plus replication. I'll have videos on this topic. But even if you don't agree with me on that, one thing that should be very clear is a lot of psychologists still accept psychoanalysis as at least a valid approach, even if they won't accept it as scientific. And that is completely pseudoscientific. And yet, a lot of psychology departments, they'll at least teach it as an important part of the historical development of psychology. And I've seen them claim, oh, Freud actually took us in the right direction. Having read William James, I'm like, no, William James was taking us in the right direction. Freud was a massive step backwards. But anyways, so that's one argument. And I'm going to have a lot of videos on how we misunderstand, misapply science. So I'll talk more about the issues with modern experimental, and really not just modern, like how experimental psychology has been done since like the 1920s in a future video. And might talk about psychoanalysis too, but not even sure that merits addressing. But the point is, this is a criticism that comes up because they hold it to impossibly high standards that they don't hold other fields to when they agree with them. They hold it to this standard because they disagree with it. And they disagree with it for, I think, are the other two reasons, which is they accuse it of being deterministic, and they accuse it of justifying sexism, racism, and xenophobia. And so then they don't like the implications, and so they say the implications are clearly wrong, we don't like these implications, therefore it must be false, which is not a valid argument. And I don't think describing, hey, this is why people act in ways we see as sexist, this is why people tend to be xenophobic, it's not the same as justifying them. And I mentioned you see the same thing with Jared Diamond, who very clearly, like, he was trying to address the rise in racialist explanations of success, and of course, the academia has largely condemned Diamond, even though popular audiences generally haven't bought into it. And now you are once again seeing a rise in these racialist explanations of differences in human success. So good going, guys. Great work. So I think both of these objections are frankly dumb, but they come from, and I've talked about Thomas Sowell, the constrained or tragic vision versus the unconstrained, or calls it vision of united. I usually say utopian vision of the world. But basically believing that there are no limits. Blank slateism tends to be part of this. And if people are blank slates, then people with the right knowledge can social engineer us to be better people, which is what a lot of the critics of evolutionary psychology want to believe. And so evolutionary psychology is fundamentally to some degree, an account of the limits of human nature and what you can socially engineer, which is, I think, part of why it's so unpopular. But I ended up finally reading Steven Pinker's The Blank Slate, which I did not pull. It's in another shelf, but I had liked The Language Instinct, and I think that was the only, maybe I read How the Mind Works. I didn't read anything else by Steven Pinker until I read The Blank Slate recently, and that's because at the time I'm like, oh, I'm sure I agree with him on all of this, so why bother? And then I was like, oh, Steven Pinker is kind of an annoying person, and I feel like I can argue with the stuff that he's putting in there, so why bother? And then I got to the point where I'm like, no, I think he has valid criticism and stuff I disagree with, and that's generally when I try to read books. And so I read it, and one of the things that was interesting is, so he referenced this book a lot, and so I got it partly because I had read part of this book where she was very critical of the author of this book, and she basically had 3 criticisms of Geoffrey Miller, who wrote this book. And so one of them is that he was sexist towards his female students, which I don't know him, can't comment on. One of them is that he co-wrote a book with Tucker Max, who is a professional pickup artist. And one of them is that he wrote a book called The Natural History of, I probably shouldn't say it to lose trust with the algorithm, but Natural History of Non-Consensual Sexual Encounters. So, quick correction. As I was prepping this video for release yesterday, I realized the book I'm referring to here was actually not written by Geoffrey Miller. It was written by 2 other writers. I still think most of the points that I made apply. I got Geoffrey Miller's book, The Mating Mind, because the way that Emily Willingham made him out, he was sort of like the evil genius, like arch nemesis of evolutionary psychology as she saw it, or as I read her interpretation. And then when Steven Pinker was praising him, I'm like, okay, 2 people, 2 different strong opinions, should at least get this book to possibly read. And then her criticism of this book is still part of a criticism of evolutionary psychology that I think is probably coming from incorrect assumptions about what the point of the book is, although I would have to read it to be sure. The only thing that really changes here is that I said I would have to have a reason to read Geoffrey Miller, think he's worth reading, before I would consider reading that book, and now it's more, I'd have to have a reason for the other writers who I know nothing about. She might actually mention something about them, and I don't remember it if I did. I just came across as Geoffrey Miller was sort of the one that she particularly disliked. Anyways, and the way she criticized it, she was accusing him of justifying and saying it's natural, so it's fine. And my guess is, I learned more about the constrained and unconstrained vision. Probably what he was saying is, no, it's not fine, but we need to understand what the motivation is to stop it. But I would have to read that book, and I do not know if I'm going to read this book. And unless I really like this book, if when I read it, I probably will not read that other book, although I've also been trying to read stuff that makes me uncomfortable, so maybe now that I'm talking about it, would not have crossed my mind to even read that book. But that's the thing, is a lot of mistakes I've made have come from not even questioning sort of my establishment training, and so it might be worth reading it to see. But I mean, I would be reading it to see, is what he said what I would predict it is, which would be one more data point in this broader pattern, and there's other books I can read for that seem like they'd be more pleasant to read. However, anyways, so before there was evolutionary psychology, there was sociobiology, and you had the exact same criticisms. I don't know if they were claiming it was non-scientific, probably, but they were certainly complaining that it was determinist and that it was justifying sexism and xenophobia and probably racism as well. And this book I actually got from my father's house, the abridged edition. At some point I would like to see if I can get like the full edition. I've read a few chapters of this one here and there. The point is, evolutionary psychology is way more than what the red pill movement has tried to present it as, which has mostly been questionable accounts of all women act in certain ways, and that's their focus, as well as also, this is why we shouldn't allow immigrants. So yeah, it does get used that way, but again, part of the reason it's getting used that way is because not only have the critics ceded that ground, but they've also attacked the people who are not using it that way, like Robert Trivers, who is one of the founders of evolutionary psychology, and I don't have, that's at my mother's house in Massachusetts, because I read it in undergrad. He's a hardcore leftist, and several of the other founders, again, pretty left-wing as well, but when you cede the ground to people like Geoffrey Miller, who are more right-leaning, then you're going to be getting a lot of right-leaning claims. But the thing is, I think basically the value of evolutionary psychology is just trying to understand humans are primates who have evolved in a certain way, And a lot of things that are pretty much always true of mammals are going to be true of humans, or animals in general. Things that are generally true of primates, probably going to be true of humans. And there's environmental factors as well, and I've mentioned reading, and I didn't pull it, but the Natural History of the Kea parrot, I think that's a good model of convergent evolution for humans. And so if you see similarities there, then there might be reasons for it. And it is fundamentally, as I understand it, as I would use it, a descriptive, okay, this is what we see, this is how humans act, and this is probably why. And ironically, I think a lot of the criticisms of evolutionary psychology is it is basically very basic primate dominance territorial politics of we don't want these other ideas that we don't like and the people presenting them intruding in our domain. And so I have seen I've watched a couple of left-wing YouTubers claiming to debunk evolutionary psychology a while ago, and I remember nothing about those videos, which tells me that probably everything they said, because I've talked about in my video on frameworks, if something is surprising to me, I tend to remember it. Probably everything they said was exactly the kind of thing I would expect them to say, and it was not convincing, not thought-provoking, and I didn't even need to address it. But I think the motivation comes from, again, believing in the unconstrained vision, wanting to believe in blank slatism, and believing that if you accept that there are constraints on human nature, that means accepting sexism, accepting racism, accepting xenophobia, which I don't think is true. And it also means accepting that you can't have social engineers who understand how the world should work and engineering people to be better people, which I do think is true and is an obstacle for these kinds of people trying to engage in this dominance politics. And so, ironically, evolutionary psychology, I think, is a good framework for understanding and criticizing the people who cannot stand evolutionary psychology and claim to have debunked it. But it also, again, I think you have to have people who are not red pill types who are using it for sexist or xenophobic ends, actually taking it back and saying this is a descriptive thing, this is what you might predict about human behavior, this is how we seem to act. And one thing that Franz de Waal talks about is we have tendencies as humans, and then you have exceptions. And a lot of the unconstrained vision, like the criticism of ideas like evolutionary psychology, is they call it determinist, treat it as if it is determinist, saying this is an absolute rule, which also the red pillars, a lot of them do, is, they have this term, all women are like that, right? Which is, honestly, a lot of things they claim, I don't think even most women are like that, but anytime you make a claim about everything is universal, it's hard to sustain because there's generally almost always some exception. And so they presuppose it's determinist, call it determinist, and then say, well, if you treat it as determinist, there are exceptions. And so there are exceptions, but often there are differences in personality or different circumstances that are hard to recreate, and you can't make all of humanity like the exception through social engineering. And so anyways, I wanted to talk about this quickly because I think I've mentioned I watch a lot of anti-establishment content, including a lot of political anti-establishment content from both the left and right, and so I've been seeing new leftist evolutionary psychology debunked videos, which I might try to watch one of them at this point, but I'm like, oh, I've been meaning to make this video. I should make it because I think fundamentally the alternative to evolutionary psychology is either following traditional religious interpretations, which might in some cases get us somewhat close, or muddling our way through without any framework, or following frameworks that assume a blank slate, like Marxism is the big one, but we have others now which are wrong and harmful. And so at least if you are operating under the constrained vision and you don't believe that all the truth can be found in one religious tradition, as far as I know, this is probably the best framework we have, is assuming, okay, humans have evolved through natural selection. Do we see these patterns of behavior? Do we see them in other animals, and in what circumstances? Okay, this might be a constraint, and it might be changeable in some circumstances. As again, pretty much anything you call an absolute, there are exceptions to, but you need to figure out where those exceptions happen, and you're never going to get everybody doing everything, much less everyone acting as the exception, make that the new norm. So anyways, I'm Magpie. Thanks for watching. I'll see y'all in the next one.